All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started a while. Assistant Secretary Evans is en route. She'll join us when she gets here. Hopefully she's eaten already at this point. I'm glad to see everybody here has had a chance to get something in their stomach as well, and hopefully not nod off. So against my better judgment, I'm going to go from script here, which I never do. So folks that know me, I wouldn't normally do something like that, but I feel this is the right situation to do that. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Huber. I'm the Chief Security Officer with Tenable. As well, I'm also a member of the U.S. Air Force Air National Guard and a Cyber Operations Squadron, so I bring that background as well. It's my honor to moderate this panel on IoT and operational technology cyber implications. We have a distinguished panel here, many of whom I've met over the course of the past 10 or 15 years, some more recently. They have a broad range of experience and initiatives from the tactical to the strategic level. I will keep my remarks very brief, but I'm also here to learn from our panelists myself. So Melissa Hathaway this morning stated there will be 30 billion, with a B, IoT devices by the end of 2020, somewhere between 25 and 30 billion, increasing our attack surface almost tenfold, which is already extremely difficult to assess. So to help level set, I want to make sure everybody in the room understands the terms IoT, enterprise IoT, OT. I think it's commonly understood what they mean, but there's actually some differences. Okay. So I want to start with a definition for the Internet of Things taken from Wikipedia, just a level set for everybody in the room here. And then we'll discuss some of the other more commonly used terms related to IoT. So IoT, or the Internet of Things, is an extension of Internet connectivity into physical devices and everyday objects. Embedded with electronics, Internet connectivity, and other forms of hardware, such as sensors. These devices communicate and interact with others over the Internet, and they can be remotely monitored and controlled. So the definition of IoT has evolved to include the convergence of multiple technologies, real-time analytics, machine learning, commodity sensors, embedded systems, traditional fields embedded systems, wireless sensor networks, control systems automation, and others contribute to enabling the Internet of Things. So we're going to contrast that now with operational technology, which is a much more concise definition, which is hardware and software that detects or causes a change through direct monitoring and or control of physical devices, processes, and events in the enterprise. So I want people to recognize here the common themes between those two types of technology that sometimes you hear used interchangeably. And the common theme here is the relationship to physical devices, processes, and embedded systems overall. So the technology underlying those components are the common themes. I'm going to also note that you also hear IIoT, the industrial Internet of Things, which is more on the industrial base. IoT generally referred to the consumer version. So the industrial Internet of Things as well, deployed in manufacturing, process control, and critical infrastructure. And then as I'm fond of, the enterprise Internet of Things, those devices used to increase business efficiencies. So as a side note here, and something that's more relevant to my day-to-day job in securing Tenable is, a few weeks ago I actually had a firewall rule request come into the information security team. I tend not to look at those very often because we get lots of those per day. But I did note, this one caught my attention because somebody was asking for a firewall rule for my vending machine on the 5th floor of our headquarters building to the Internet at large. And of course, I scratch my head and wonder, where the heck is this thing? Where did it come from? What network is it already on? And who's it talking to? All of which I have no idea. From my perspective, this just showed up, and they were asking for access to the Internet at large, which led me to all those questions, of course, I didn't have an answer to. So when we talk about these devices that may seem innocuous, in this case, that I would call enterprise IoT, in that case, a vending machine that's on the network. Those number of devices for IT, you could argue they're in the thousands. For IoT, or IIoT, or enterprise IoT, hundreds of thousands of devices. So my ability to assess and fingerprint and determine what those devices are becomes extremely difficult. So as you can see, the attack surface for IoT, enterprise IoT, industrial IoT, and operational technology affect the ability to achieve physical effects from the home, so consumers, to the office, enterprise IoT, to national critical infrastructure. So previously, the military used the terms kinetic and non-kinetic to distinguish between cyber means and not cyber. And I would assert that those terms no longer apply, as cyber can now be used to achieve both kinetic and non-kinetic effects. hence the term effects-based operation in this case. So with that understanding, I'd like to quickly introduce the panel members, noting that you have their full biographies and the information available to you. And after the introductions, I'm going to give each panel member 5 minutes to discuss the topic at hand related to any initiatives they or their organizations are pursuing and work as it relates to IoT and operational technology to help us reduce this growing attack surface. And then at the end, I'll allow sufficient time, hopefully, to entertain questions. And when we get to that point, I think we have a microphone over here. Is this the only one? I believe. Yeah, microphone up here. If you could find your way to the microphone when you get to Q&A, that would be fantastic. So now on my right, we have the Honorable Karen Evans, Assistant Secretary, Office of Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, U.S. Department of Energy. To my left, Ron Fogg-Hahn, as I understand it, his call sign. He's the Executive Vice President for Strategic Growth at AECOM. On his left, Dr. Reiko Kondo is the Director of Office of Director General for Cybersecurity, Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications from Japan. Dr. Jarno Limno, CEO for Tozibox and Professor for Aalto University, is that correct? And then to the left, Ms. Jeanette Manfra, Assistant Director for Cybersecurity, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And last but certainly not least, for those of you who know Joe, Joe Weiss, Managing Partner for Applied Control Solutions, and dare I say, industry stalwart for ICS and all things IoT and cyber. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start the conversation with a few questions, and then we'll see how it goes from there. So actually, roll back here. So we're going to give each of you the 5 minutes to discuss cybersecurity and the application implications as it relates.
You could have started with.
Oh no! I'd go right into the questions, and I don't want to do you a disservice, Karen.
That's okay.
So please, we'll start with you, since you just joined us, and hopefully you filled your belly before you arrived here.
No, that's okay. I was running from another meeting. Hi, I'm Karen Evans, and I am as billed on the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response. So it is known within Department of Energy as CSER. So it is a new office that has been formed because the Secretary does have the highest priority. Everybody within the Department of Energy really is looking at the roles and responsibilities as a sector-specific agency and what we are required to do under the FAST Act going forward from FAST Act of 2015 and what the Secretary's responsibilities are as it relates to a grid emergency. And so the Secretary has really taken the approach that if we have energy security, then we'll have national security. And so he set up this office with the intent of it being all hazards from natural, man-made, looking at everything. So it's interesting, your definitions. I appreciate those definitions. But his major concern and what he loses sleep over all the time is, and he talks about this all the time and calls up, is that when a natural disaster is happening and we're reconstituting services, his concern is that that's probably when we are the most vulnerable as a nation. And so he really is concerned that our adversaries could then exploit that opportunity. And then when we're in a position of reconstituting services from a natural disaster, from a squirrel or man-made, that we are trying, you're using hardware and software and you're using services that may not necessarily have been fully vetted because you're focused on trying to get the service up and running. And so that is why the office was set up. The things that we do as a sector-specific agency, we do in partnership with DHS as the lead, so I'm sure Jeanette will cover some of the overall DHS activities, but we do take the whole of government approach. There are some specific projects that we are looking at that hit specifically on the topic areas that you're talking about. We are very focused on operational technology, and what does that mean? The convergence of the two. We have taken the approach that the IT world, there is a lot of solutions in the IT world, that's not like where we're focused, that we're really very focused on what does the energy sector need, operational technology, and then from our area, when you're looking at Internet of Things and the things that you've described from that, from our standpoint, the Internet of Things can encompass anything from microgrids to solar panels to how are you going to have that resiliency of energy generation, and how do you make the grid itself resilient. So from renewables of using electric cars, plugging into your house, how your house could work, all of those things then they're really great innovations. But when we look at them, my group, we're looking at each of those as a new attack vector coming into the grid. So the other big initiative that the department has announced, so there is a funding opportunity out there that we are doing jointly with our energy efficiency and energy renewable group that is a cyber institute focused on advanced manufacturing, because our goal is to take advantage of all the innovation that is out there, to be able to use all of these different devices that are there, but really get to the heart of the issue of supply chain risk management. How are they being manufactured, and can we reduce the risk in the advanced manufacturing piece of this so that we can take advantage of all the technology. So I'll stop there and let the rest of the group go.
Thank you. Fong?
Well, I couldn't ask for a better first speaker. So, Secretary Evans, thanks for that, because some of the things that I'm going to talk about apply directly to that. So, first of all, I have a goal of this panel. So I sit on a number of panels throughout, and a couple years ago, I actually sat on a panel with Joe, and disappointingly, I had dinner with him last night. He didn't remember, so I'm hoping I do well enough this time that Joe actually remembers that I sat on a panel with him. So. Anyway, so at AECOM, we're a large infrastructure firm that does a lot across not just infrastructure, but in services. And so one of the things that we looked at is kind of this understanding between the physical and the digital worlds, and go, what does that mean? We actually created a term we use just to characterize, we call it converged resilience, of understanding the impact of the digital and the physical. We see that now as we move in, and obviously as we talked about already, and Bob, I loved all the definition on all the various, IoT, OT, enterprise IT, how does that all intersect and how does it all relate? A couple of points I think are important for everybody to understand and kind of frame the discussion as we go forward. One is the fact that we have to understand, when we think of cybersecurity, we have to think at it through all the applications and all the devices throughout the entire life cycle, from inception to decommissioning, right? So the challenge is we constantly bolt new things on, right? We get new capabilities as we get smart homes, right? We talk about now, we just introduce a whole bunch of new attack vectors, and how do we understand what the potential of those attack vectors are? The next challenge is the fact that we can't secure everything equally. I tell this all the time. I do a lot of work with oftentimes at C-suites, with CEOs, and primarily with CFOs, who oftentimes have the responsibility for risk. And one of the things they always ask me about is, well, I want to make my business or my enterprise completely secure. And I say, we can do that. There's a couple of simple steps we're going to have to do in order to make you completely secure. We're going to have to eliminate all employees, all clients, and then I think we have a shot at it. But if you're going to have employees and clients, there's no way you're going to be 100% secure. So rather, we have to understand your individual operation and then look at, and I really love the term resiliency that Secretary Evans talked about. How do we, yes, we want to take precautions, and certainly when I look at the fact of standards and regulations, they do a good job of having to secure us from past threats. They don't do such a great job of looking at future threats and how we recover. So the goal becomes, how do we recover? And I absolutely love the comment about worrying about how does an adversary take advantage of an event, whether that's a man-made or natural disaster. In fact, last year, we did a really fascinating exercise that we had the Department of Homeland Security, we had FEMA, and we did it in the city of Houston a year after the hurricanes. And we did a cyber event that was held in conjunction with a hurricane, and what the implications of that were. And it was unbelievable working with the Army Cyber Institute, that we really didn't understand how to put those things together, because oftentimes the things that we need to be able to do to respond are open up new threat vectors. So obviously the concern after a natural disaster is we got to get water, we got to get power back, right? And so there's suddenly policies and procedures that are in place, we open up new vectors and new threat vectors. And it's interesting because we don't even understand sometimes when we think about, I heard this from one of the utility from the city of Houston, from the water department, and they said, well, we have no worries about a cyber attack in any shape or form. I said, really? How come? He said, my system's completely closed. I have a completely closed system. I said, okay, well, how is maintenance done, or things are added? How do you check on that? And he goes, oh, I've got a contractor who does, and he comes and hooks his laptop up. Completely closed system. Awesome. There's no vulnerabilities there. So we see the fact that it really does become about, we're never going to secure everything. When we look at it, and we really have some challenges, because I get nervous when I see, I always look at new technology. I always, my background from the Marine Corps is, I look at the threat first, and then the advantages second. We always tend to jump on the advantages first, and then don't necessarily understand, like the threat factors of, hey, I've got a smart home, and I can manage, my energy from my phone, not understanding what potential vulnerabilities does that create. I also look at things like AI and go, what is that going to do? Because I now worry about the fact of, and the easiest way I can put it is, my previous life, I flew EA-6Bs, and one of the most challenging jobs was managing. We had this is long before GPS. We had a kind of archaic navigation system, and one of the things you worried about was drift. And so when you did updates, every time you did an update, you potentially induced what we call drift or error. When I look at AI, my fear is something about that it's collecting data, it's making cognitive analysis off the data. What if the data is just slightly skewed? To ultimately achieve something, or for the AI to go in a direction we're not aware of, right? And not understanding that there's, and for lack of a better term, I'll use data drift. There's data drift that's not noticeable, it's not grotesque, it's not something that you would understand and go, I recognize that's an anomaly and I can take action. But subtle little things that ultimately could change the decisions and the outcome and ultimately the output. And as we get into more and more with robotics and machine to machine and AI, that becomes a concern. Can I introduce an algorithm that just enters gentle drift that I'm not going to recognize, that ultimately could have impact or ultimately can think? So I think there's challenges. I think the more that as a community we communicate threats, we understand vectors, and then it really comes down to about how do you, yes, prevention is important, recovery is equally as important, and understanding how do we put those so that we know that we can recover. It was interesting, when I was living in Texas, I belonged to a country club, and I came in one day and they're like, hey, Fogg, you're in cybersecurity, right? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, we've got a problem. They had a ransomware attack, and they took all their files. They couldn't do any billing. So they couldn't sell anything from the pro shop. They couldn't log tea times. They couldn't do anything. They're like, what do we do? I go, well, what's your backup? And when was your last backup? And they go, we don't have a backup. I go, pay the ransom and then get a backup. And next time when you have a backup, knowing that you're resilient to this, so you go, this doesn't impact me, or I lose maybe a few hours and I've got a backup system recover. So those are the challenges. And with the introduction of more sensors, and we're only getting, and Bob, I think you put it, what, 30 billion, crazy number that we see every day, just the sensors we see in our own lives. So compelling challenge. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I just want to touch on that point that you raised as well, is the fact that we're implicitly trusting the sensors, which if you're a geek like myself, operate at the lower level of a Purdue model, level 0, 1. We implicitly trust those, and we've started security at the top level, so the IT components, and we're working our way down. But the assumption is, as you both mentioned, is implicitly trusting the data coming from the sensor initially, which if there's drift or the data skewed, how do you detect that? And I know that's near and dear to a couple folks on the panel who are going to touch on that as well. So that said, Dr. Kondo, to you.
So, good afternoon, everyone. I belong to Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, Japan, and also I have a position in Cabinet Office. And MIC, Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications, is in charge of IoT security. So I just would like to briefly introduce you what we do. Recently, IoT devices such as cameras, web cameras, printers, and monitoring systems are widely used. And cyber attacks against IoT devices have been increasingly rapidly. We have a national laboratory, which is called National Institute of Communications and Technology, which is called NICT. And NICT observes global cyber attacks in real time by monitoring their darknet. Do you know darknet? Unused IP addresses. Using the darknet consists of about 300,000 unused IP addresses. And they use a system which is called NICTR and analyzes attack methods based on collected data. The number of attacks observed by NICTR last year was 150.4 billion, which was 2.8 times compared to that of 2 years before. Among them, targeting IoT devices increased by 5.7 times over the same period. So, in response to this serious situation, IoT devices, Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications Japan, MIC, published the comprehensive package of IoT security measures in October 2017. You can check it on the website. And actually, when dealing with the vulnerability of IoT devices, the method of security measures differs between IoT devices already in the market and new IoT devices to enter the market in the future. Security measures can be taken by using a certification system for newly sold IoT devices, having certain security measurements requirements, or deploying IoT security gateways. However, these measures have not been taken for IoT devices already in the market. And considering the infamous IoT malware Mirai, which took over the vulnerability of IDs and passwords of the IoT devices and hijacked the many devices, it's necessary to develop a system to widely investigate the vulnerability of passwords for IoT devices. So in response to this situation, we amended the Act on NICT last May. The amended NICT Act allows NICT, National Laboratory, to scan IoT devices via the internet, identify the IoT devices with improper password settings like 12345 or 0000, and then provide the IP addresses and other information to the related internet service providers, ISPs. Then these ISPs alert the users of the IoT devices and urge them to change their password settings. So what NICT do is kind of active scanning to put the ID and password settings and try to get into the devices. So so this active scanning project is called Notice, and we just started this project this February. Actually, the similar notification efforts have been conducted by ISPs using honeypots since 2005. It's like 13 years ago. However, this time this is different. This is an active scanning thing. And for new IoT devices to enter the market in the future, MIC is now developing an IoT certification system which requires just basic security measures to IoT devices which are directly connected to telecommunications network. For example, these IoT devices will be required to have a function to encourage users to change the initial password settings. At the same time, detailed IoT certification measures are expected to be developed by the industry, private industry, in order to be flexible for the technological changes. So MIC is now preparing for the related ordinances, notifications, and guidelines for implementing the security measures. And this one will be coming in enforced in April 2020. And as for OT security and supply chain security includes both the IoT and OT. I'd like to just very briefly introduce you our efforts by the Cabinet Office. Actually, I have a position in Cabinet Office as well. So the effort is called Strategic Innovation Program, or SIP, and then this started in fiscal 2014. And annual budget for the SIP program is about $300 million. And SIP identified about 10 areas as research areas, and cybersecurity is one of them. And for the first period of SIP, which is from fiscal 2015 to 2019, we focused on OT security for critical infrastructure. And for the second period of SIP, which is from fiscal 2019 to 2023, we focus on cyber physical security for IoT society, especially aiming at mitigating supply chain risks. Since there is a huge gap between IoT and OT communities in terms of cybersecurity, we've been closely working with critical infrastructure operators and related ministries from the beginning of the project, and trying to establish secure OT environment preparing for the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games in the year 2020. So maybe I'd like to mention to some of the our initiative later during the panel. So thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate that. So from my perspective, that's a unique approach, the active scanning. I'm sure most people in here would shake their head and say there's no way that's going to happen. But the flip side of that is, like myself, as a security officer for a company, I have a Schlage Sense front door lock. I have a Lyric thermostat. I see software and firmware updates all the time, change the default username and password. And I'm not going to say that I don't. I probably don't, or I normally don't. So you're instead of putting the burden on the user, in this case the consumer in many instances, now you're actually feeding them information to tell them exactly what they need to do. Because otherwise you're looking at your phone, you're flipping through, you're seeing the notices, you have no idea what that means. And I know, like myself, if I run a firmware update, I'm praying that that thing doesn't lose power during the firmware update, because I've pretty much just lost or bricked my device in that instance. So it's very rarely people are willing to do things like that. But there's simple changes that can be made to improve the security of those devices and at scale. So I appreciate that. So Jarno, Dr. Lindno.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I have to say that it's always a big pleasure for me to be in this conference. This is probably, I was just counting, 4th or 5th time to be in this conference as a speaker. And coming from Finland, it's even better thing to be here in the Washington, especially this time of the year. But I was actually thinking about revealing you, just in this room, a very big secret in the beginning. You know that according to the latest UN report, the happiest country report, Finland was actually ranked to be the happiest country in the whole world. I know that it's very hard to understand when you are looking at me, but anyway, on the other hand, we have been ranked also to be the safest country in the whole world. So the main question is, and this is the secret part, that okay, we are the happiest and the safest country, how we do it? Any ideas? We are also #1 coffee consuming country in the whole world. So ladies and gentlemen, if you want to be happy and if you want to be safe, also cyber-secured way, just drink coffee. I'm actually bringing up very shortly 5 points when we are talking about IoT, especially in the strategic level. First of all, everything, ladies and gentlemen, will be connected to internet, sooner or later. Literally everything. And I think instead of we are using the concept already IoT, Internet of Everything, we should start using the concept IoE, Internet of Everything. Because when we are digitalizing everything, And we have to keep in mind that the main target, what we are digitizing in the world at the moment, is actually us, humans. We are digitizing human brains. So one of the key points when we are talking about these huge numbers of different issues that will be connected to internet is, and that's my first point, we should also consider what should not be digitized and what should not be connected to internet. I think that is very important point also from the ethical point of view. My second point is that everything will be smart. We are already, of course, talking about smart cities, smart cars, smart hospitals, and so on and so on. But if security is not taken care of, smart means same as vulnerable or exploitable. Smart means in that case exploitable or vulnerable. So in a key principle, I know that this is very simplified to put it, but what we have really not understood, not yet, is that security by design principle in IoE era is a must. And security can't be an afterthought in this development. The third point is that, of course, it's all about connectivity and data. Actually, a vast and increasing amount of the data. And as we very well know, the currency of the IoE era is data. And actually, the connectivity is the issue that really changes the world. But that brings to my third point, and that is the role of the artificial intelligence. When we are having this a lot of data in the world, I think the artificial intelligence and especially the new approach to the AI analytics is going to be much bigger thing in the coming years in this sense. Fourth point is that as IoE proliferate, new ecosystems will emerge, and I am pretty sure that there will be commercial and technical battles, I would say even pretty big battles between these ecosystems in the coming years. My fifth point is actually the most important. What I have learned in my job, in the academia and in the business, that actually instead of talking about security or cybersecurity in the IoE or IoT era, we are more and more talking about actually the concept of trust. To what and to whom we can trust. And I think this trust theme will become more and more important in the coming years. So maintaining and strengthening trust is in the heart of the IoE. And in a way, I think we are also in a very good place because we are now creating the culture, because security is always a cultural issue. We are now creating the culture in the IoE era. And how we are going to do that, that is the key question what we are answering and hopefully thinking about very globally in the coming years. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Lindno. So I think you raised an interesting point in that for safety integrated systems, speaking of them for a moment, there's safety envelopes they operate within. The bound should never be higher than or lower than. And I think at least at this point in time for most of the IoE devices, as you refer to them, I like that, those bounds don't exist today. So we implicitly trust the data coming in, but we haven't established those norms or those safety envelopes like you would with a safety integrated system. Maybe that's something we have to pursue in the future. Ms. Manfra.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeanette Manfra. I'm here from the newest federal agency in the U.S. government, the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. We were officially created and named in statute last November, though we've actually been around for about 15 years. Just took an act of Congress to rename us. But what that our organization was started really in the fallout and the aftermath of 9/11, and thinking about how do we work with non-federal entities, the private sector in particular, but also state and locals, to protect the homeland and to share information, and really thinking about it principally as a terrorism issue. And so we're given a lot of unique authorities, a lot of capabilities to really think about what does it mean to manage risk in the homeland. And as the threat changed, and we had much more on cyber, we started as a very small group that was focused on federal cyber or other civilian federal agencies, and have since grown significantly, really to think about the threat now principally being in the homeland around the potential for significant cyber events. I'm the assistant director of the cybersecurity part of the agency. I have a colleague who's the assistant director for the infrastructure security, so the physical side. We still focus on physical threats. Soft target security is a large priority for us as well. So what we've done over the years is build a framework for how we work with critical infrastructure owners and operators, whether those are federal agencies or state and local counterparts or the private sector, to really think about how do we help them protect the systems that they own. We don't own the systems, they own the systems. And we've learned a lot over the years. But in particular, in the last couple of years, we've learned tremendous amount through a couple of significant events. The OPM Incident, where actors chose to take significant amounts of data from our personnel system, elections, Russian targeting of our energy sector, a variety of things that really sort of brought to home a few key lessons. And for us, it forced us to go a little bit back to basics. And so when we talk about risk, we sort of think of it in this classic sort of function of threat, vulnerability, and consequence. And you want to try to have your finger on all three, and ideally getting all three of those components more in your favor to have an overall reduced risk to the country. When you're talking about cyber, that can become quickly quite overwhelming. We talked about billions of devices connected, and increasingly so, and actors increasingly using systems and platforms in a way that we hadn't envisioned, and consumers never being the most savvy. And so how do we tackle this? And then do it in a way that it isn't through a cyber-specific lens. Our adversaries don't have a cyber-specific lens. They're looking at holding the United States and many of our countries at risk. And so how do they do that? And so I appreciate the definitions around Internet of Things and industrial Internet and all that. I do think some of those terms can actually be distracting, and I think, in fact, they distracted us. And so what we realized is we were missing the big picture. We were getting better, a lot better, at technical indicator sharing, those types of things. We were declassifying things faster, getting them to people, more and more people. We have thousands of industries. We have global information sharing organizations now where indicators are being shared, and we're learning more and more. But were we actually having an impact on reducing the threat, reducing our exposure, or mitigating the potential consequences? And I think the hard answer is probably not. And so we said, well, if it's not the devices, what do we really care about? And I assume most governments do this. You do continuity planning. What do you have to do if all the bad things happen in the world, and what are the things that you still have to keep up and running? Businesses do it in business continuity planning. And it's not so much about the systems or the devices, it's about the functions, right? And it's about those things that we actually care about. It's about the process of generating and delivering electricity. It's about our elections system overall. It's about our financial markets. And so we took a step back and spent roughly 8 months or so with industry and said, what is critical from a functions perspective, not from a software, from a device? We still need to get there. But what is critical from your perspective in making our country run? And so we're nearly complete with this process in developing what we now call a national critical function set. And it's really taking, in some cases, people will say, well, it's obvious, right? You know, we want to generate and deliver electricity. We want to have a wholesale payment system that is safe and secure. We want to have a DNS ecosystem that works. But really going through that exercise and sitting back and thinking, these are the things that our country right now depends upon. Some of them are digital, some of them are not. Some of them are on their way to becoming more digital, some of them are not. And then really thinking about what are those functions, having common expectations between us and industry and our state and local partners, even coordinating internationally with, I assume everybody generates electricity in roughly the same way. So it's, the sort of thinking about how are these similar. And then taking a look at how would an adversary disrupt these functions. And by taking a functional approach, what we're starting to, and we're not going to try to boil the entire ocean. We know we can't reduce all threat or reduce all vulnerabilities or mitigate all consequences. But by focusing on those critical functions that our citizens and travelers and particularly global customers rely on in order to work, we think we'll get much more fidelity both on how do we disrupt an actor's ability to target those systems, and then do start to get down to, well, what is the software? Do we have one piece of proprietary software that everybody in this critical system uses? Yes, the answer is yes, in many cases. And so is that something that an actor would use a supply chain attack against or something others in order to get in there and disrupt that? It's also thinking, again, broader than just cyber mechanisms. They look at insider threat. It looks at combining cyber and physical. It looks at taking advantage, as Karen explained, of an emergency to inflict other damage. And so it's taking a much more risk-based, holistic approach, but at the same time continuing to drive down to where we can build a system, and this is really our ultimate goal, where we have a common set of indicators and warnings between the government and the private sector on what it would look like and how we alert off of those warnings if we have an adversary tripping something that we're especially concerned about. And that means that we may not be focused on every single consumer device that is out there. Though increasingly we know some of them can be used as a vector for another attack. But I think it's important to prioritize, and it's important to focus on what it is we're actually trying to protect, and importantly, what an adversary is trying to disrupt when we're talking about these very significant, at least in my department, what we're focused on. It's not to say that we're not focused on criminals and others continue to ensure that we are doing our best to deter those, but when it really comes down to it, our role has to be on protecting the homeland from these very, very significant threats. And so we talked about threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So then it becomes, well, what are all the tools? And not just my agency, we have a lot of tools, but we often act as a convener for other agencies. So how do I ensure that our intelligence collection is best postured against what we know to be the risk inside of our country? How do I ensure that we are hunting in the right spaces, using those tippers to hunt in the right systems to get those adversaries out? You've seen potentially a lot of publications. We've been publishing a lot on North Korean malware and Russia and China. A lot of just outing their infrastructure. Frankly, it makes it harder for them to use it again. So what are all those tools? There's obviously a lot of other tools that aren't going to be public, but continuing to think about how do we take all of the tools that the government has available to it, how do we do it in partnership with our allies around the world to make it harder for the adversaries to disrupt these truly critical systems. Not all of them are operational technology, but many of them are. But some of the early indicators, frankly, are not once they get into the operational technology, it's when they're in the business system trying to make the jump into the OT. So how do we set up those tripwires? How do we ensure that we're creating a system that can alert of the threat? But then we have to also we can't just over-focus on threat. There's a lot more we can do collectively on reducing and deterring the threat. There's a lot more that we can do on vulnerability. We have an entire team that does nothing but vulnerability coordination. When security researchers identify something in a medical device or an aviation system and have some concerns, they work with us, and we can help through the disclosure process. We also work very closely with our intelligence community partners. There's been public information now about the vulnerabilities equities process. How do we ensure that the government is making decisions when it talks about disclosing vulnerabilities that we may find? So we have the role of ensuring that we're representing that defense side of things. And then more importantly, how do we understand where systemic vulnerabilities are? We do a lot of assessments, and we have increasingly understanding of where you might have a choke point, common suppliers, common systems. So what are we doing to engage with the owners of those common, those potential areas for an adversary to scale a large attack? How are we working with them to reduce that vulnerability? We publish a lot of vulnerability information. Hope people find it's useful. But really getting from both the tactical vulnerability and getting that coordination process working with between the increasing amount of vendors in this space as well as security researchers. But again, continuing to focus on understanding the broader systemic vulnerabilities and what are those leverage points that we have to reduce those. And then lastly, on the consequence, when you have a continuity plan, ideally you have a contingency plan associated with how you would manage through that. And so what are those contingency plans? And so that's what we're starting to develop as we identify these functions that are critical, and we identify these indicators and warnings. Well, what are we going to do about it if we do identify? Or in an equally likely scenario, we don't identify and something is happening. And so what are those contingency plans? How do we build it into our emergency response doctrine? How do we both do what is useful already in our emergency response doctrine, and if people are dying, if houses are on fire, we need to focus on the people dying and houses being on fire, and the cyber part is probably going to be secondary, unless of course the cyber part is causing the people dying and the houses being on fire. So how do we work through some of those situations? We have had some really good national level exercises, as well as what we call Cyberstorm, that we sponsor every couple of years, thinking through these, and really pushing the envelope and trying to figure out, are there gaps in policies, are there gaps in authorities in order to be able to respond to a significant cyber incident, and what is different about some of these incidents that may not exist in current doctrine. And so the idea then, of course, you want to mitigate those consequences, and getting those plans in place beforehand is always the best way to do it. As all emergency responders tell you, you don't want to be exchanging business cards on the scene of an accident. And so how do we do that and have that understanding? What is the responsibility of a governor when a company is under a cyber attack, but they just happen to be headquartered in their jurisdiction? These are a lot of hard, important questions that we've got to figure out and we have to work through. So we're working very closely, and particularly with FEMA and the state and locals on that. So that's what we do. We also have a tremendous amount of work that we do in the federal civilian and a lot more authoritative. We do not have regulatory or directive authority on non-federal entities. We do on the federal side, and so we're using that authority to sort of push the federal government to be more secure. And ideally be leaders in security. We've required things like DMARC. Believe we are still the industry leader on DMARC, which is an important tool to reduce your vulnerability. We banned the use of Kaspersky in all federal agencies. We're doing these publicly. While I can't tell everybody what to do, I can tell you what the federal government is doing and the decisions that we've made. So some of you are familiar with US CERT, ICS CERT, NCIC. A lot of people ask org questions. All of those are a part of my organization. We're all in one place, and we will continue to coordinate just as the new Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. So thanks.
Thank you. So Joe, last but not least, realizing you are probably the only engineer up here. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'm kind of the techie here. Number one, I wanted to thank Catherine for inviting me here and to be able to talk to you from the perspective of what is reality and what do we really need to worry about. I'm a control system engineer that got into security. I deal in facts and physics. Securing the networks are necessary, but are not sufficient to secure control systems. The grid can work without the internet. The internet cannot work without power. We do things backwards, okay? Consequently, when I started the control system cyber program at EPRI back in 2000, it was about trying to keep lights on. Networks had nothing to do with it. It turns out that the following 9/11, that's when things really changed. Because prior to 9/11, the engineers owned everything. And that included cyber. Following 9/11, cyber was taken from all of the engineering organizations everywhere and moved to IT. And the unintended consequence of that was, to IT, cyber is the networks. Well, the engineers didn't come along with that. But more than that, all of the engineering devices fell off the turnip truck. In other words, all of our sensors, actuators, drives, power supplies, analyzers, they are not considered part of the network. To this day, in 2019, we have no cybersecurity requirements whatsoever at the actual sensor, actuator, or drive layer. If you can't trust what you measure, how in the world can you be secure? It also says one other thing. Since we have absolutely no security or authentication in these devices, what does a vulnerability assessment mean? Go back and think about what vulnerability is about when you have no security at all. The other point when I'm coming at this is when you compromise networks, whether it's malicious or unintentional, your outage duration is normally hours to days. You can even think of the 2003 Northeast outage, the 2008 Florida outage, even what happened in the Ukraine. That's hours to days. We had a utility, it's the only one I really know of, that had its SCADA system targeted and hit. They lost SCADA for 2 weeks. It took 4 man-months to recover, but they didn't lose power. Losing SCADA does not equal losing power. What happened in the Ukraine is they went to manual operation for probably 6 months. Why? They couldn't trust the networks. You're all looking in the wrong direction if you want to keep lights on and water flowing. These are engineering systems. The Aurora vulnerability, this is what was demonstrated in 2007. This is simply opening and reclosing breakers. It's using physics to damage or destroy things like generators, motors, and transformers. This is how you bring the grid down for 9 to 18 months. And no, you do not find this from networks. If you really want to do damage, you go to physics. And yet, the engineers have been pulled away from here. And by the way, the Russians have been in our grid since at least 2014. So if you're asking, do people know these things? Every junior engineer, your freshman year in college, is taught never, reconnect AC equipment out of phase with the grid. That's all Aurora is. This doesn't take a nation state. Stuxnet was also a sea change with implications well beyond what anybody thought. This was essentially hacking equipment, and it was to make it look like mechanical malfunctions. Stuxnet went on for about a year before anybody realized it was cyber. They thought it was a systemic design failure of those centrifuges. And in those cases, those were Siemens systems. What changed further is what happened in 2017 in Saudi Arabia. This was where they attacked the Triconic safety systems. Not to shut the plant down, it was to blow the plant up. This was to do physical damage. It's the only reason you go to safety systems. And by the way, Triconics is Schneider. This is not a Siemens problem. This is every control system vendor's problem. What made this different and should shake everybody in this room up was that malware was found in August 2017. What really happened was that plant tripped in June 2017, and nobody knew it was cyber. We don't have the ability today, even when a plant is tripped, to detect a cyber attack. That should scare everybody. This goes to the heart of everything we've been saying we should be doing. The real gap that we have is not IoT. Those are figments. I've got a new term. It's called packets versus process. As an engineer, I care about the process. What IT cares about are the packets. I can change anything and everything before it is a packet. You will not find anything. Where are we? I wanted to also bring up a couple of things that I heard. In fact, I wanted to bring up one other. Just so people don't think this is just quote-unquote industrial infrastructure. We had a data center that was cyber attacked, and it fried every single server in that data center. And it came because they compromised the uninterruptible power supplies. You won't find this on any networks. If you want to do real damage, this is where you go. And I just wanted to bring up a couple of things that I've heard because I'm at the end. One is, I was on a committee or a panel, whatever, through Idaho after Katrina. Why? We're trying to figure out, how did you bring everything back when you couldn't get people out and you had to live with residual vulnerability? Okay? That goes all the way back to Katrina. The second point is, I've worked on sensor drift. I've been doing that for basically my whole career. What happened with the Bellingham, Washington gasoline pipeline rupture, what happened with others that was sensor drift in cases. The sensors didn't fail. Today, we don't have the capability of knowing if the sensors are really doing what they're supposed to do. Plus, we have no idea if they're compromised or authenticated. This is pressure, level, flow, temperature, voltage, current, radiation. I can keep on going. This is what's been left off because it's the engineering side of the world. The last thing I wanted to mention is, if you want to get an idea of what IoT is, I had to do a walk down. For all things, it was a DoD-related activity. It was going out to a couple of large utility-scale solar facilities. The first one we went to was roughly 150 megawatts. It was the size of a small coal plant. This utility-scale solar facility had over 2 million panels with a sensor and an inverter on every panel. And each bank of panels had a small PLC. Think about that. That's one utility-scale solar facility. That's like putting a sensor on every lump of coal that goes into a boiler. That's what's reality today. And we have no cybersecurity there. And by the way, there is no cybersecurity in the transformers because we have no cybersecurity in the temperature sensors, the voltage sensors, the transformer tap changers, you name it. None of our research, zero, has been aimed all the way down at the basic engineering devices. That's where we are today.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate that. So we've heard a couple recurring themes, and I'll add to Joe's point of trust, which has come up several times now. I worked a few years at Idaho National Laboratory, essentially penetration testing, control systems, IoT, utilities, power plants, what have you. And for the most part, there really wasn't anything fancy we did from a cyber perspective. It was exploiting trust relationships, trust of the sensor device itself, trust of the operator, trust of the engineer, and exploiting connections they already had, trusted connections in that case, and modifying that data coming from those trusted devices. And oftentimes, rather than actually conducting cyber attack, we would convince the operator, the engineer, to take the action we intended them to take versus actually doing the work via cyber means. So I think it's very important to note. So to the panel now, yes.
Can I have just a very short comment, especially to the Joseph, because that's very important point to raise up here. We have to understand, like you very well said, I would say every society, like United States as well as Finland, we are software societies already. Our critical infrastructure is run via software. Every business in Finland, in United States, is already a digital business. And then we come a little bit, when we are talking about Russia, we are coming to the cyber. And I know that that is not the topic of this panel, but just one point, because that's something what, how would I put it, we are paying a lot of attention in Finland, especially to Russia, because we are just located next to Russia and has been more or less always. When we are talking about critical infrastructure affecting other nations, society, when we are thinking about Russia, we are usually thinking about that in the hybrid warfare or hybrid influencing context. And in purpose, when you are doing that kind of hybrid influencing operations, you want to stay behind the so-called declaration of war, below it, don't cross it. And in that sense, when we are thinking about the security and also thinking about the IOE or IoT, we have to pay more attention to Russia's capabilities in both cyber technical capabilities, meaning breaching in for certain systems, manipulating data, so on and so on. But I would say we are pretty often forgetting when we are talking about the cyber that the biggest battles in cyber battlefield, so-called, will be forth our thoughts, attitudes, our values, and then we come to the cyber psychological influencing methods. And they are developing all the time. So I think one of the key points in this, because there is so much expertise in this room, is that, for example, the election security is a very hot topic in Europe at the moment. But if we are preparing the Russians' interference, both cyber technical and cyber psychological, those methods, what we have already seen, or what has already been experienced, we are one step behind. So we have to foresee a little bit what is the next wave in these different influencing methods. And I think that is a challenge for us when we are thinking about our digital societies nowadays.
Thank you. So I want to be conscious of everybody's time here. So I believe we approach the point for Q&A. We do have a microphone up here on the right-hand side. If anybody would like to ask any questions, please step up to the microphone. In lieu of that, we'll press on with some questions here. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Dave Weitzel from NIST, National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, and the MITRE Corporation. So what industry members and what industry sectors are we see doing a good job? And I know that they're out there, but are there some that you want to brag on? I know Kondo-san, also there's good interaction between industry members in Japan and the government. So if you could comment as well. Where are we seeing good emerging best practice in these areas?
So generally, and actually, in Japan, we specify 14 areas as a critical infrastructure, and which includes like financial, communications, and energy, and so on. And then, especially financial area is doing fine because they have a strong regulation, and then they are always looking at the Ministry of Finance, and then they are strongly regulated by the ministry. And then actually, also the communications industry is doing quite fine, and actually MIC is kind of have a really good relationship with communications industry, and then they have ICT ISAC. Do you know ISAC, right? And then what they do is industry-based information sharing, and then also they try to predict some cyber attacks. And then the good thing is ICT ISAC is the first ISAC which was established in Japan. And then they have a long history starting with the telecommunications ISAC. And then recently several other ISACs like medical ISAC or transportation ISAC, and they come to ICT ISAC and consult with them how to establish ISAC things. So the good thing is communications industry, ICT ISAC have a good knowledge, they have a specialist, and then they give their expertise to other ISACs. And then also ICT ISAC has a good relationship with US ISAC. And then recently we work really closely with them, and then we exchange information, and then we exchange the best practices. So in that way, I believe that communications industry is doing fine because of their network expertise.
So I would be remiss if I didn't brag on the energy sector. And I would like to highlight the piece that Bob talked about. And there is a long history in the energy sector, and the piece that you hit on is that trusted relationship. And the trusted relationship between what the federal government does and the whole of government and what industry does. And then the industry itself across, we have three ISACs in there. And how we interact with industry, because it's all owned by private industry. They also have taken, when we do emergency response, they have mutual assistance across the board. So they recognize that when something happens, whether it's going to be cyber or natural, they can pre-position resources and help each other out in order to keep the power up and how they're going to do things. And then we work very closely through the government coordinating group, and Jeanette can, I'm sure she'll want to speak more to this. There is a lot of cross-sector communications that is led by DHS. So especially when we're responding, we look at the cyber as just another response mechanism. And so there is a huge trust relationship that makes this a little bit easier as you're introducing new concepts within the energy sector, because they do trust each other and they do share information.
Yeah, I happen to be the managing director of ISA 99. That's the International Society of Automation. That's the Control System Cybersecurity Standards, the 62443 series of standards. It was originally really pushed by the chems and petrochems, and now it's probably one of the most widely used. Arguably, the industry probably, or the two industries who probably are least involved, are electric and nuclear, which is kind of a shameful thing. But that's probably, in my mind, the best. Now, having said that, I wanted to bring up one other thing. I led a special task group, and the special task group was to ask, do those standards apply to our legacy sensors, actuators, drives, in other words, the Purdue Level 0, Level 1? And the answer is no, they do not. The Society of Automation Engineers has come to me. I'm supposed to be giving a presentation to ASCE on smart cities in a few months. What has fallen off everybody's radar are these lower level devices. Nobody is doing that. In my mind, and again, I came out of the electric industry, actually came out of nuclear also. ISA 99 to me is by far the most comprehensive set of standards, and all of the vendors are on it. All of the big players are there. And at the network layer, trying to separate 0, 1 from up above. When you go up above, to me, that's there, and there is a lot of interworking relationships there. It's just not below. That's where we're missing everything.
I can add I'll just do 30 seconds because I have no desire to be the one to rate our companies. I think my first answer would be according to what measure are they doing well. We worked really hard on the cybersecurity framework with NIST, and I know internationally a lot of organizations are adopting that. But what is the standard of care? What measure does good look like? I can tell you anecdotally, it's not so much an industry by industry, it's a large versus small. So every industry has large players, I think, that seem to do very well. You could look at whether they're in compliance with the various different regulatory regimes that are in place, and they probably do better than the small and medium. But I think it's a common question that we get, and I just sort of there's. According to what measure is anybody doing well in cybersecurity, and I think that's something that we need to keep pushing on.
Thank you. Tom Farmer from Envoy Strategy Group. I would like the panel to address where the responsibility lies in the public or private sector for raising the consciousness of the user mindset. Nobody has really talked about the user's role in helping to assure security. And for as long as the internet era has been with us, the majority of breaches and catastrophes are at least partially enabled by user error. And it seems to me there's very little public consciousness of the vulnerabilities and threats that you've laid out so well here. When I buy a stepladder, it is festooned with stickers about warnings and cautions and ways to kill yourself with the thing, many of which are the product of government regulation. When the consumer buys a smart home device, the instructions say, plug it in. You're going to like it. Whose responsibility is it to generate that stepladder sticker culture in this arena for the IOE universe, and who takes the lead?
So I think one of the models that we've been looking at is Underwriter Laboratory and working with them. We already have a consumer electronics. We'd like to see it, an industry-driven standard process. It's hard when a consumer is faced with a $1,600 device or a $400 device. Like who's making that case? And there's really no case to be made to, even my family who's generally more secure, we don't buy any devices like that in our house. But, it's still, I think it has to be industry-driven standardization. I think sort of when you buy your microwave and it's got that UL sticker on it, you're like, all right, it's not gonna blow up in my face, and I have some belief that it might not cause me cancer. But we need to have something probably along those lines when you're talking about consumer devices. Otherwise, you're just not going to incentivize investment because the average consumer is just going to always pick the $400 device.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say to that is I think the challenge, somebody said it earlier, data is the currency of IoT or IOE, however you want to phrase it. And the challenge becomes, ever do a software update on anything? When you install that home device, it's got a 4-page thing that you got to say I agree on. Anybody ever read that? What you'll find is that you basically agreed to give all your data away. Mm-hmm. And so when you have an Alexa or some other device in your home that is literally just absorbing data and distributing that, it's a complex problem from a user standpoint. Two things I would say. Number one, it's driven by what we demand, and we demand more information. And just look around. I was just out on campus, beautiful day before I came over here, and look at what everybody's doing. I went to college in the 80s, and everybody'd be sitting on campus throwing a Frisbee or sitting around a group talking. What are they all doing now? Crazy. But that's, it's a different environment. So I think we have to understand that environment. A couple points I think we have to look at that have to be the foundation going forward. One is zero trust. So I think the concept of doing zero trust and understanding and saying, when I develop a system that's going to come in, I got to understand and expect that everything is compromised. And then build security framework understanding that my system's probably compromised. Because my guess is if I scanned every single device, in AECOM I think we have roughly 100,000 employees. I can guarantee you there's malware all throughout. So you have to make certain assumptions. By the way, I hate the term smart city. I've seen very few smart cities. I like the term connected cities. Most of them are connected, very few of them are smart. And the reason I say that is without real security, very difficult to be smart. What we've done is open up a lot of new attack vectors, but we are connected. So I think understanding connected and how do we go from connected maybe to intelligent or to smart is the challenge that I think that we have. The drive for data is jumping us into the connected. I don't know that I would say that we're at the smart or intelligent.
So I would add that that's exactly why we announced the Advanced Manufacturing Institute as it relates to cyber. It's to integrate the pieces that Jeanette has articulated as what is the best way to be able to do that, because a consumer, to Ron's point, is not necessarily going to read through all the terms and uses associated with, I'm going to put a smart light bulb in my house right now, right? Because I want to be able to control my electric bill. So that's exactly why we announced it. If we had the answer, we would actually implement it. And so we're looking for the collective across the board with that institute so that as you do it, you're engineering it up front. So to Jeanette's point, that these technologies become competitive and the market then is incentivized so that the user then can adopt them by reducing the risk.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Robert Orr. I'm from Appian Corporation. And I'm just a software engineer working in InfoSec. And at first I was going to thank Joe for demonstrating that engineers can also swim in this pool. But then after hearing him talk, I just wanted to say thank you for scaring the living crap out of me. Anyway, my question is whether the Bloomberg report is true about the supply chain attack on the motherboard, the additional chip on the motherboard. It does bring up the vulnerabilities of our supply chain. And my question is for anybody on the panel, where are we with respect to supply chain vulnerabilities and attacks, and what can be done about this? It's very related to trust, so I'll just leave it at that.
I can, well, from our perspective, there was, I think there's a lot of, people mean a lot of different things when they use the term supply chain. This is like the first thing that I learned when I started wading into supply chain. And you could be talking about business relationships, you could be talking about hardware components, you could be talking about who wrote your code and how do we get more transparency in that. So I think part of what is really important, like we define the terms in the beginning, is what are we talking about when we're talking about supply chain? Because we tend to see more on the business relationship manipulation supply chain sort of things than in actually in these very complicated kind of hardware, which tend to be mostly theoretical. So what we've looked at is we identified a few gaps over the last few years internal to the federal government in how we were thinking about third-party risk for IT products and services. So that's how we narrowed it down. Let's say, okay, let's talk about third-party risk for IT products and services that the federal government procures. And there was a lot of barriers to how we actually aligned our procurement decisions with any information that the government may have had available to inform those procurement decisions. And really a procurement culture in the federal government, which I've learned from a lot of companies, it's actually quite the same. It's, you're really trying to shield yourself from legal risk and trying to get lowest price technically acceptable, and which is, it's a low bar. Worked with Congress. Actually, they passed some pretty landmark legislation in December, standing up a Federal Acquisition Security Council that I'll represent for DHS, and some others will be on there, but really looking at how do we think about our entire acquisition and procurement models to incorporate mission risk into these decisions that we're making. So it's a very, very heavy lift, but we've got to be able to, and also provided some protections because it starts to get a little wonky when you have to make sure you're providing due process and transparency. And then there's this sort of this larger ecosystem of, how do you protect the U.S. sort of as a whole against some of these. And so we narrowed it down and focused more on what I would call kind of the digital supply chain. So the information communications technology industry stood up a task force, and they're working on 4 lines of effort that I'm not going to go into detail on, but really looking at how do we build that trust, how do we get the information so we're not just holding it in these super secret counterintelligence channels, but that we're actually operationalizing that information. How do we understand, again, risk? We often get a really good picture of what we think is a threat, but then we'll talk to industry and be like, it's really not that big of a deal, or vice versa. They may see something that's a big risk that we're not tracking. So we're working with all of these companies to get a set of how do we build that trust? What does a qualified manufacturing list look like? What is those sorts of things to where we can get to some tangible outcomes. We're not going to solve everything. We're trying to help people understand, like, you should probably know where your coders are coming from. Try to push some more transparency on digital supply chain. Where is your software actually coming from? But we're only going to tackle some parts of it in the initial stage.
Okay, so real quick, in the energy sector, so I would again be remiss if I didn't talk about the national labs, but we do have a specific project that we have underway called Citrix that's actually looking at the components. So a lot of the things that Joe talked about that scared you, we're actually down in those, looking at that to see where, actually down at the hardware, how do you leverage that, the information that's coming out of that. And I liked his point about physics because we're looking at quantum key distribution and how you use that in order to assure that data is the data. I know a lot of the industry is looking at blockchain, but we're actually looking at physics as physics. And so the way that you can use quantum key distribution onto the reliability of the data that would be coming out from these multiple pieces of equipment. And then as we're doing that analysis, we share that out with the sector as well as they're buying different pieces of hardware. So the piece that he brought up about transformers, those are huge. So we know the risk associated with that, and those are not manufactured here. So that's how we're looking at this, and then what is the biggest impact and what is the widest deployment, and then looking at that, and then how do you then move from there. So we're leveraging a lot of what is happening in the national labs, and we have a short-term one, which is our Citrix, and our longer-term issue and initiative is the Grid Modernization Initiative, and we have a Grid Modernization Lab Consortium, so it's the best minds from the national labs looking at how do we then leapfrog into the next generation.
So I believe we're out of time at this point, correct? So I think I could wrap this up pretty easily by saying trust and assurance, trust and assurance, trust and assurance. That seems to be the common theme, whether it's at the sensor level, whether it's at supply chain. We keep harping on the same themes, and I think work going forward. I know there's a lot of working groups for supply chain, both within and outside the government as well, and this 863 addresses supply chain as well. It's the trust component to the sensor level that seems to be at issue in a lot of cases. So I want to thank the panelists for your time, attendees as well. Thank you very much.